Talks continue tonight between the U.S. Treasury Department and airlines who are applying for help as passengers have virtually stopped flying, says CNBC. And this national graph from people checking in for flights tells us a lot. Look at the yellow line. A big question, is the aid coming fast enough? The Association of Flight Attendants says payroll grants were supposed to start coming on April 6th. That was last Monday. The union fearing job losses instead of a financial bridge that would last until September 30th. But CNBC reports negotiations have involved the government converting as much as 30% of grants into low-interest loans and warrants that would allow the government to buy shares in the airlines.
You can make an argument that if you're going to use taxpayer dollars to bail out companies, including Boeing, by the way, that the taxpayers who are taking a risk deserve to have a reward.
Scott Hamilton studies aviation globally for Liam & Company.
Here you're talking about just outright grants, and yes, this seems to be coming in with now a repayment structure as well as the equity kicker of some kind. But this is not too dissimilar to what happened after 9/11.
And if a good number of airlines don't come out of this crisis in relative health, what are the chances they'll be buying new airliners from Boeing or Airbus anytime soon? John Ostrower is editor-in-chief of the Air Current.
So, the reality is there is no good answer right now as far as the state of play. Airlines don't want new airplanes.
And Ostrower believes one of the reasons Boeing has brought workers back to complete delivery of planes like the KC-46 tanker for the Air Force is these are planes that can be delivered and paid for. In Everett, Glenn Farley, King 5 News.